Today we're going to talk about one of the most defining and honestly one of the most tragic chapters in American history, the Civil War. This wasn't just a series of battles. No, this was the moment the nation turned on itself, the crucible that would ultimately forge the United States we know today.
Just look at that number for a second. 600,000. That is the estimated number of soldiers who lost their lives in just 4 years. It's a number so large it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around.
And to really put that into perspective, think about this. The Civil War cost more American lives than World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. This was a conflict of absolutely unimaginable devastation, and it wasn't fought on some foreign shore. It was fought right here, in American towns and fields, by Americans against Americans.
So the big question is, how on earth does a nation get to the point of waging war on itself? Well, the answer isn't simple. The war didn't just start with a single shot. It grew out of these deep divisions that had been poisoning the country for decades.
By the middle of the 1800s, you basically had two different countries living under one flag. In the North, you had this booming industrial economy built on factories and wage laborers. They wanted protective tariffs to help their businesses grow. But the South? It was a completely different world, a massive agricultural society whose entire economy, especially King Cotton, was completely and totally dependent on the brutal institution of slavery. They needed free trade to sell their crops overseas. These weren't just small disagreements, they were two opposing systems on a collision course.
And while the economics were a huge part of it, let's be absolutely clear. The undeniable, rotten core of the entire conflict was slavery. In the North, the abolitionist movement was picking up steam, calling slavery what it was, a profound moral sin that made a mockery of the nation's promise of liberty for all. But for the South, it was defended as a matter of pure economic survival, and they argued a constitutionally protected property right.
So, how did Southern leaders defend this? Well, they built their argument on something called states' rights. This was the idea that the federal government had very limited power and couldn't interfere with the state's internal laws, and that specifically meant laws that upheld slavery. This became the go-to legal and political justification for everything, especially for their fight to expand slavery into new American territories out west.
And then, the final domino fell. In November of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Because his platform was explicitly against the expansion of slavery, the South saw him as a direct threat to their entire way of life. Just 1 month later, South Carolina was out. They seceded. By February, 6 more states had joined them, forming the Confederacy. And then, on April 12th, the talking stopped. Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter. The war was on.
What followed was 4 years of absolutely brutal, bloody warfare. Now, in the beginning, the Confederacy actually had a lot of success. They had brilliant military minds like Robert E. Lee, and they were fighting a defensive war on their home turf. But the Union always had the long-term advantages: more people, more factories, and more resources.
A huge moment came in September of 1862. General Lee's Confederate Army marched north into Maryland, hoping for a decisive victory. This led to a clash that would change the entire meaning of the war. The Battle of Antietam.
Just try to process this number. 23,000. That's how many men were killed, wounded, or went missing, for both sides, in a single day.
To this day, it is the single bloodiest day in American history. Now, on paper, the battle was technically a stalemate, but it was a huge strategic win for the Union because it forced Lee's army to retreat. And that military outcome? It created the exact political opening President Lincoln had been waiting for.
Lincoln seized the opportunity and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This order declared that all enslaved people in the states that were in rebellion were now and forever free. It was a political masterstroke. It completely reframed the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. Now, it was a fight for human freedom. And critically, it made it impossible for European countries like Britain and France to support the Confederacy.
But the real, decisive, you can't come back from this turning point of the war happened a few months later. In the summer of 1863, the entire fate of the nation really came down to what happened in 1 month, July.
It was like a 1-2 punch that the Confederacy could never recover from. Out east, the Union Army crushed Lee's final invasion of the North at the Battle of Gettysburg. At almost the exact same time, way out west, General Ulysses S. Grant captured the city of Vicksburg. This was huge because it gave the Union total control of the Mississippi River, which literally cut the South in half. The path to victory for the Union was now clear. After another year and a half of savage fighting, including General Sherman's infamous March to the Sea, the end finally came. On April 9, 1865, in a small courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant. The 4-year nightmare was over.
But winning on the battlefield? That was just the beginning. The war forced the country to face some hard truths about its own ideals, and it kicked off a wave of change that would reshape America forever.
The results of the war were literally written into the Constitution with 3 incredibly important amendments. First, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, everywhere, for good. Then the 14th granted citizenship to everyone born in the U.S., including the millions of formerly enslaved people. And finally, the 15th guaranteed that no one could be denied the right to vote because of their race. These 3 amendments became the legal foundation for the civil rights movement 100 years later.
You know, there was also this really subtle but profound change in how people talked. Before the war, it was very common for people to say, the United States are, plural, as if it were a collection of separate states that happened to be working together.
But after the war, that changed. People started saying, the United States is, singular. It might sound like a tiny grammar lesson, but it shows a massive shift in how Americans saw themselves. The war settled the question once and for all. America wasn't a loose alliance of states, it was one single, indivisible nation.
So when you look back, the war's legacy is incredibly complex. On one hand, they created a single, unified nation and ended the institution of slavery. Those are monumental achievements. But it also left behind these deep, painful scars. The Southern economy was completely shattered, creating economic problems that would linger for generations, and the social trauma of it all that would echo through the country for the next century.
And then, in a final heartbreaking twist, just 5 days after Lee surrendered, President Lincoln was assassinated. His death stole the one leader from the nation who might have been able to steer the country through the incredibly difficult years of Reconstruction that followed.
The Civil War answered one huge question. Would the United States survive as one country? The answer was yes. But it left us with another, tougher question, one that, in many ways, we are still trying to answer today. How does a nation truly, deeply heal from a war fought against itself?